Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my very good friend, Joe Kelly.
Good to be with you, John, as always. And I had a question. What's going on across the pond these days as far as, requests for information about groups? Are you finding through pandemic that there's been an interest in the topic in general, with people who've kind of had it on the back burner, but are now confronted with the reality of a family member or friend who they want help with or they want guidance with? Have you found that?
I don't work with ex-members and stopped doing that quite some time ago. Generally, my work is the broader field of authoritarianism. So seeking to give advice to as many people as possible through this channel, through what I'm writing. However, I am fairly well connected with people who are, and I'm hearing that there's been a tremendous increase, an upsurge of interest in the last year. That people are,
producers and reporters are contacting me, almost daily to do some kind of program, and our colleagues have been able to do some of that work. I don't have as much interest in that. I did one short article that Vice did a few days ago, and the question was, what was your most dangerous cultic involvement or help that you had to give to a dangerous group? And for the most part, we're looking, as Pat, my colleague, talks about often, is quality of life issues. There are those horrors of people being trafficked. We won't deny that group exists. There are many born and raised little sects that, are up hidden away in the mountains and in the valleys in places we don't even know. Small self-styled groups under the guise of either some new age authority or a church elder or an apostle or prophet.
I mean, you have polygamous Mormon communities
the
in the US,
various, and various different levels of abusive environments for those fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. I think Christina Katas is doing a great job at, she may be considered controversial to some people because there is a group who feels she's enabling. But I find that her work is brilliant because she's engaging with individuals who need help. And she sees her role as supporting and, benignly influencing those individuals in a way that isn't typical of people who require more of a demand at cutting off from various elements of the culture they were raised in. As we were talking about before, that almost like, okay, so you were in a cult, fine, we've got that out of the way. Now we can deal with the real problems. What did the cult do to you? What limitations do you feel, have been given to you or offered to you by the group? And how would you like to find your true self or your old self? As if
new self,
your new self, both a combination of the cultic self, if you want to use that term, I hate it, and your where you find yourself to be.
How do you integrate your experience? How do you digest what's happened to you? Whichever metaphor, or whichever way we have looking at it. Yeah.
And it's forced us to look at the nuance as a result of the influences of the conspiracy theories. And you'll call it QAnon. In some cases it is. In other cases, it's just various conspiracies that have arisen up and caused a gulf to exist between family members, where the irrationality of, as reported by the family to us, is such that conversation can't take place. And what we find is the frustration with having to deal with a family member believing in this nonsense as they present it, is more than they can bear, because this is somebody who they could have a rational discussion with up until they learned of this conspiracy. So it requires a new way of looking at the issue. We're not dealing with an overarching figure as the leader. We're dealing with many different individuals in the shadows, if there is such, and communities that exist only virtually.
Yes.
So it's making up for the village. Their village has been shrunk down. They're not out on the street, if they were, engaging with their neighbors, through pandemic. And so it's isolated so many people in their bubbles.
Yes.
Hopefully we're seeing the end of that with vaccination and coming out. But what impact has that had on the kinds of situations that we're being asked to advise on?
I think that for a long time I've taken the view that the Lifton's text as guru is more significant than the charisma of the leader. In small groups, that there may be charisma, which I would tend to think of in Max Weber's way of looking at it, which is something at the interface between two people. I think there are people who are genuinely charismatic, but I've not really seen much of that among cult leaders in my study.
No, and that's the irony of it. And yet that becomes part of the definition, a charismatic leader.
Yeah, charisma. And
I think Weber's, definition fits it much more readily and accurately, in that it's that relationship, that whatever it is that you find of value in the leader is something that's not universal. They're not somebody that's going to step onto a stage and excite the crowd. There's very few Mussolinis who could get out there and make a rally happen. And even Emma Goldman, I watched a documentary the other day about her, how she was able to draw a crowd in and keep them engaged. She had her rhetorical style was brilliant, apparently.
Not something that was true of Hitler when in making Triumph of the Will, Lenny Riefenstahl, who sadly was only allowed to make 2 documentaries, the other one's Olympia, sadly, because they're brilliant. That visually she did things that nobody had ever done before. One of them was putting a camera so that it would spiral down a pole and show you what was going around.
And no one had thought of that before her. And you look at that work, and the topic, of course, is something that none of us want to glorify, but the cinematography, just extraordinary.
And she said that filming it was relatively easy. Editing it took her 6 months because Hitler kept picking his nose, so he really wasn't. And reading accounts of him, he wasn't a very charismatic man. To move away from him, though, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Ron Hubbard's great grandson, Jamie DeWolf.
How is that intergenerational influence for somebody who was he ever involved with the movement, with Scientology?
His grandfather left the movement in 1959, having for 7 years been, the deputy, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs, and having called his own son L. Ron Hubbard III, which is not a name that he decided to retain. So, in fact, Jamie was brought up with the surname Kennedy. De Wolf was the name that his grandfather adopted to not be a Hubbard anymore. So he could be L. Ron de Wolf. So he grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family, and there's a fantastic performance by him called Salvation Summer Camp on YouTube, where he talks about being 8 years old and being in a summer camp where they're told Jesus is coming today, and we're all going to, the rapture is going to happen, which is, but with Jamie, I met him in 2015. He did 4 performances at our Getting Clear conference, Getting Clear of Scientology in Toronto.
In Toronto, yeah.
And I was just amazed. It was, I've said it to him, I've said it to other people. It was like seeing Bill Hicks with a Raymond Chandler script. He's so precise. Jamie has charisma. His great-grandfather, Ron Hubbard, had no charisma whatsoever, but somehow managed to create the situation. So I think the dogma has always been essential to me, that in dealing with somebody as they were coming out of Scientology, the first thing was to show the contradictions in Hubbard's own teaching, not to say here is school records or this is what other people have said about him, but here he is saying he's a war hero, here he is admitting he's not. One's on a tape recorded lecture, the other's in his handwriting. Getting that cognitive dissonance working in somebody, the conflict within the leader, so that they could then start to look at the organization and say, actually, I've been abused. I've been put through these 12-hour, I did a 13-hour registrar interview at one point where this money lender was sat there with a check trying to force it on me for 13 hours. And I said no, because it was a stupid idea paying 30% interest on this money. But they then start to recognize what's wrong with the organization. But there's this last stage where I think for all of us, we have to go back, and I did it quite spontaneously. I left Scientology because I thought Hubbard had gone. I thought that these young tykes had taken over and they were ruthless. That was the word that was used. And I don't want anything to do with people who are ruthless. That's Genghis Khan for me. You've got to show mercy. You've got to, So I left, but I left to continue Scientology. I became the center of, the UK independent movement, and within a few months lost faith because I saw the contradictions in Hubbard's own statements, which had been carefully kept from us, really, because there's such an outpouring of material from this man. More, Guinness Book of Records lists him as the most prolific author of all time, certainly the most prolific talker of all time. Much of it is just transcripts of lectures that they've accepted as being written works. But nonetheless, there's all of this material. You're not exposed to it. I saw that, he wasn't what he'd claimed to be. He wasn't a wounded war hero. He'd never studied with any gurus in the East. And he wasn't a nuclear physicist. He was a guy who, by his own admission, and for those who want to check, the tape is called Introduction to Dianetics. It was a recording made on the 23rd of September, 1950, where he admits that he basically flunked his course in atomic and molecular physics. He never studied nuclear physics at all. And it's a quite different subject, as any physicist will explain. Very different, getting into all the quarks and all that stuff. But for me, I came to this point where I said, well, is this stuff true? I don't think I'm competent to evaluate that from the point of view of a believer. I think I have to become a disbeliever and reevaluate it. So I said, okay, I reject it all. And I will, over the years, I will look at it, over the weeks, however long, I will look at it and I will include those things which I find relevant and true. And that's the advice I've given to everybody since. That was in 1984. You can't walk away and say, I don't believe it anymore. You have to reevaluate it. You have to say, is this true? Is it useful? And I must say that with Scientology, there's nothing in 37 years that I've deemed true and useful, because anything that seemed useful. So if you looked at Hubbard's ideas about marketing, something non-contentious there, when I first read that stuff when I was 20, and he's just read Rees and Trout, Positioning the Battle for Your Mind, and here is his positioning theory. And he said, you should go to the original of any idea. So I went and read Rees and Trout as a 20-year-old Scientologist and went, he hasn't understood it. What he's describing is not what they're describing. So I agree with what Rees and Trout said, and I found the same is true for any principle in Scientology, that wherever he stole it from, the person understood it better than he did. No charisma, text as guru, this idea. What we're seeing with QAnon, this
text
whole
as guru.
There is no guru. Q is a hidden, probably imaginary figure.
There's some suspicion that new HBO documentary suspects that it's this guy Ron Watkins, in Sapporo, Japan. I don't know if you've seen the latest.
I haven't seen that. No.
It's called Cue the Source, I think. And it's a little bit of a different take, and who knows? We can't say for sure. He was playing with the idea that it was Ben and that it was Roger Stone. I can't see Roger Stone being that organized. He's a dirty trickster, but I can't see him putting together that kind of program. In any case, the calls that are coming in my role and Pat's role has been really to slow the families down and offer them coaching. It doesn't lend itself to a classic intervention environment.
No.
And so that's changed a bit our role when we're encountering these QAnon and conspiracy theorists. It's a whole different kind of thing. Yet the impact on the family harkens back to the days of the New Age, self-appointed trainer who, and get someone involved, a husband, a wife, a loved one. It's a lot like that. The reptile beings, and they're coming across the southern border. And David Icke,
David Icke, bless him.
Yeah.
The man who took ayahuasca and saw 12-foot lizards and can't quite make his mind up.
And who wouldn't?
Yeah. I think the whole influence of the Texas Guru, the internet as a place to take information. I'm interested in Robin Dunbar's ideas, and he's recently been writing about friendship, and I must read his book because he gave us the Dunbar number, this idea that a group of about 150 people can get along together. And what's happening is, as you say, that's transferred from being your village to being your online village. And the village grew pretty big. I think there are 3 million people on the QAnon Facebook site, subscribers, followers to that.
And the problems, the anti-QAnon folks are now in the hundreds of thousands. When I first encountered the Reddit group, it was 10,000 people, and now it's in the hundreds of thousands.
I wrote a chapter which will be coming out hopefully sometime this year in an Oxford University Press book, which is co-wrote it with Steve Hassan. And the question was about being radicalized without a leader, the lone terrorist, this idea. And we went and we looked at Dylan Roof, the Charleston killing. We looked at Elliot Rodger, the La Vista killings, an incel. Yeah. And this idea of, in looking at it, it was very interesting for me. I spent the first 3 months trying to find individuals. Nidal Hassan was the other who we included in the end, against my better judgment, because I think he was psychiatrically ill. And I think that was what I found with one person after another who had committed lone terrorist acts, that they weren't actually coming from Daesh, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right. Whichever. Yeah. In fact, of course, both in the US and in Britain, we still have more right-wing terrorism than we do Muslim terrorism, or it's wrong to call it Muslim, Wahhabi, right. Whatever.
Wahhabis, yep.
But to find that people can develop these sort of hate ideas, and I was shocked when I started looking at US white nationalist sites, because there are things on there that you could not say in this country without going to court. You're calling people names, inciting hatred is a criminal act in this country. Because we saw the reality of it with people like Omar Bakri, who was saying, let's kill the prime minister. And murders started to be committed by members of his group. And people went off and committed so-called suicide bombings as a consequence of his teaching. And so we stiffened our law and said, telling people to go out and kill people and calling people, let's not get into any of these names, but rousing hatred is a bad idea. I was genuinely shocked by the white nationalist sites and this disdain for other human beings, which is foreign to me. I'm not left wing. I'm not a libtard. I'm just a guy who believes in democracy and respect, courtesy towards other people. I don't see anything good coming out of the pretense that we are genetically in some way separate from other people. You know, I'm with the science on this one, that, that our genes go back to the mitochondrial eve 238,000 years ago. All human beings, you know, from an assay of, what was it, 147 placentas from all around the world, there's this same point in the mitochondria that says we're all descended from the same place. So as far as I'm concerned, we're all black. Some of us are just a slightly paler shade of black, or a slightly, you know, more exotic shade of black than others. And, you know, the thought of neo-Nazis who've got no idea that, firstly, to be a Nazi, you have to have a Führer. And David Duke's gone now. Hitler's definitely gone. And you can't be a Nazi unless you've appointed an authoritarian leader who tells you what to think and what to do. The other thing is, of course, they're not Aryans. They call themselves at some time the Aryan nation, some of them. But there's no way that Hitler would have accepted as Aryan people who were not of Germanic, Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon so-called origin.
Right. And there are some, I think, Southern European and Hispanic names in some of the leaders of the Proud Boys and the other groups that would not be accepted as
if you're going to be racist, let's do it properly.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's be accurate about who we're accepting.
Of course, when you get down to that, with the Germans, we're only talking about a linguistic group. We're not talking about the
genetic.
reality. Yeah, the reality is that it's the country where I live was first settled by people who appear to have come from the Ukraine, and we're now finding out fascinating things about that culture. It was not, the culture that inherited the earth was the Sumerian, Babylonian, Indian, Chinese, Egyptian culture, which has, God, king, pleb. It's a sort of straightforward.
There wasn't much of a middle class.
Ukrainian culture appears like the Indus Valley culture not to have had these distinctions, to have been a truly equal culture. From the archaeological work that's going along there, they were the people that settled here. Then a bunch of people from the Middle East came, and then you look at the movement of the Alans and the Swaves and the Vandals across Europe and into North Africa, and who anybody is, where anybody comes from, and what percentage of these kind of, I think, rather spurious tests online that'll tell you what your original nationality is.
Yeah,
I'm a little, but the point is that we're all part of a human family, and we're either going to be at war with each other forever and destroy the environment, or we're going to start talking to each other. And so the rise of the echo chambers on the internet, the way that hatred has become emblematic of certain groups, you kind of look back in history and you go, well, civilization is the point where the blood feud ends, where the famous example in US history is the 5 tribes which became the 6 tribes, the Iroquois, and that they buried the hatchet. That's the expression we take from them. They stopped fighting with each other. It did mean that they then went and exterminated the Mohicans, so it wasn't tremendously peaceful, but we remember Hiawatha as their orator. We don't necessarily remember that a guy called Digana Vida was the guy that came up with the ideas, but he had a speech impediment, and that was, you couldn't be a leader among the Northern Iroquois if you had a speech impediment.
I guess not.
It all gets very confusing, but aspects of the US Constitution come from that point where 5 tribes come together and say, why are we wasting our time killing each other when we could be killing those other people? If we could get beyond that to why are we wasting our time killing each other and hating each other when we could be actually building an earthly paradise? We're so close to it. We've got so many resources and so much going on, and people are the environment's collapsing, rather than do you know about the Serengeti Rules?
No.
It's one of my favorite things. It's a book, and there's a wonderful, wonderful documentary, and it starts up by saying it's all doom and gloom about the environment. Now, here's some science. And they show that there's this thing called a keystone species. Wherever you go, and in the Serengeti, it's the wildebeest. And there was this thing where wildebeest numbers started accelerating tremendously, and people were saying, you've got to cull them. And the guy who had control of the area said no. And suddenly the numbers leveled off, and the other species started to come back. The same has happened looking at sea otters and the kelp forests off the Aleutian Islands, that the whaling industry took away the prey from the killer whales. So the killer whales went and ate all of the sea otters after they'd eaten as many seals as they could get. And by restoring a keystone species in the rice paddies, it's a spider, they found. By restoring this species, places have been rewilded. Huge areas of the world have been rewilded, and something is being reestablished. And I think we have to get this balance that, rather than falling into apathy because the situation is so dreadful.
It's so big.
If we could focus on that instead of dividing the states so that people who, have some Mexican ancestors can live in this bit, and people just this, and understand that it's where cultures meet and intermix.
I'm looking forward to seeing the paper.
I'm an interesting point in my career because, I'm proposing another book which will be about the crazy things that people believe at the moment. So I've delved into Nexium, and I think I know more than enough about that now. QAnon, and again, I'll work with Steve Hassan on this, and looking at the mad things that people have come to believe, and proposing some ideas, the same things that you and I have worked with for decades, that can help people to overcome that, and also incorporating Yuval Noah's ideas about all belief and fervor, which I think are outside of, say, Alan Shefflin's social influence model. Yuval's the only person I can think of in, Carmen Alamendroth is coming forward with some ideas, certainly. But
from a different point of view, I think Yuval's approach makes it digestible to most of us. Coming from a more clinical point of view, it's more academic, and so it's interesting. It's important work, but I think Yuval has a lot to offer.
Yeah, and I think that it's almost that the last great ideas come from the social psychologists, Muzaffar Sharif, Edgar Schein, Kurt Levin, on through Milgram to Zimbardo, who's the last man standing of that generation, bless him.
Yeah.
But it's almost that the work stopped with the Stanford Prison Experiment.
That's right.
And now, of course, that's being all of that work is being undermined. And some of the arguments like Gina Perry in Australia, I think, has put forward some very good reasons why we should be skeptical.
Yeah.
But the problem is we can't repeat any of those experiments because they're ethical, and we have to find some way of moving forward. And I think that Yuval has provided that, to look at, inconsistent, how emotionally driven we are. My son Sam, actually, he found a talk I'd given a few months before I first met Yuval, and he said, "Dad, you were working on the same things." It was like, well, yes, the peak experience and the euphoria and making people high, all of that, but the precision that Yuval has brought to this, so that we can understand the difference in response between a low fervor and a high fervor person, for example, and how much involvement occurs, I think is extremely important. But going forward, it is, I am withdrawing from this work. I'll be 66 in June. And
that's young.
It is. It's very young, but I put aside
You've done your time.
Yeah, I put aside my work as an artist, which is how I made my living when I was 28. And along the way, I've written some novels and I've done other things, but I want to shift the focus because this work is all done for free.
I know.
And
I know that.
even to the extent that if people make a subscription to the channel this is broadcast on, it goes to pay my assistant's bike for the work she does. So, you know, if you want to make personal payments to me, no. No,
yeah, pay John.
Hey John, that's it. This is the new group we need to form, you know, the reverence. And if people had a little shrine with some candles and a picture of me, and
but still pay John.
Yes, they can have, you know,
even with the shrine.
Absolutely. But I want to, you know, get back to the, you know, the work I did as a musician. Both my two boys who live with me are both fine musicians. I'd played the drums and sung since I was a kid. I want to get the other two novels out and all of that stuff. So for me, there's
a few things in the pipeline.
Yeah, there's a transition happening, which, but what I've realized in having these conversations, and in, you know, in large part, it's conversations with you, with Pat, say with Hoyt Richards.
Oh yeah, I you know, Hoyt was. I was on his case. I was one of the people there when he was involved with Eternal Values. Me and Joel Greenberg and Kevin Garvey and Hoyt's brother, Randy, who was the force behind the event taking place, and a good friend of his from college. And he's talked about this openly, so I can.
I found that in, you know, and Joe Zimhart as well. My friend Roger Knight.
Brilliant. Yep.
I just love talking with you guys. So where I was sort of thinking, you know, I have to slow down because I'm putting up 3 videos a week, and we'll slow down to 1 a week probably. But I can't, you know, I can leave the other part of it, but these conversations are just too much fun. You know, I can't. So I'm gonna have to do my, you know, fix my timetable a little differently, so I've got time to do other things and not be so focused on this.
Fair enough. You should.
Yeah. And you know, when in the novels I've written, 2 of which are published, my concern is for the same things, but to examine them. Somerset Maugham said, if you want to understand psychology, find a good novelist. And I've just read a Dostoevsky novel, which is so rare it's not been translated into English again since the 20s. It's called A Friend.
So you read it? You read Russian?
No, it's not been translated since. I found a 1920 translation that was reprinted in 1969. I wish I did read Russian. I beautiful language, and what an amazing culture. What a shame that such a rift has happened between the governments of the West and Russia, because, you know, it's a great culture. And I've been to St. Petersburg, which was just a wonder and a marvel, which I'd recommend to anybody. But anyway, this Dostoevsky book, which is called A Friend of the Family, my friend Professor Alexander Dworkin in Moscow said, oh, this is a novel that Dostoevsky wrote about a cult group. And it's about a little family cult and this guru who comes in. And if you want to understand psychology, read Dostoevsky. You know, he had Dostoevsky syndrome, of course. And the book The Idiot describes that. It's now called temporal lobe epilepsy. Yuval put forward the argument, which I totally agree with, that Ron Hubbard and a number of other authoritarian group leaders suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy.
I did witness Swami Prakashana, the guru I followed for a number of years, have an epileptic seizure, and wow. it was sanctified. It became a state of high spiritual development.
Wow!
And it was mimicked by some members in the group.
Yeah. Wow! Amazing things. So, I mean, I've written. I wrote a novel called Voodoo Childlike Return in the 90s, and that was really strange because I went and saw Margaret Singer. I met her in 93, and we went out and had dinner, and because her husband Jay is the only Nobel laureate that I've ever had dinner with, and he insisted
I guess
on
he's the only Nobel laureate I've had dinner with. Come to think of it.
There you go. What a gorgeous human being he is. Was. But he insisted on well, he didn't insist. He actually politely asked if he could order everything in this Japanese restaurant. The food was fantastic. I said to Mara, it's 10 years since I left Scientology, and I've never asked anybody this, but would you mind theraping me? Her famous word for therapy. And so 6 months later, when I was back, we spent 3 hours together, and she did exactly what I did, which is you ask somebody, what seems to be the problem? And they tell you that. When they start repeating themselves, you say, well, what do you think you could do about it? And they'll give you 5 suggestions, 3 of which are crazy, 1 of which will get them locked up, and 1 of which might work. And you say, well, I'd do that for you. But I sat down with her, and I'd not thought about it at all. And I just said to her, I just opened the conversation by saying, when I was 15, I saw Jimi Hendrix at the Isle of Wight, and 18 days later, he was dead.
Oh.
And something changed in the world at that point. And I went to
Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah,
now that send John money.
Yeah, send John money.
Yeah.
Buy my books, read them, promote. Yeah. Here's a piece of self-advertisement. When I did the Toronto Getting Clear conference in 2015, this wonderful woman Betsy turned up, and she'd never been in a cult. She'd worked on nuclear power plants as an electrician, though she was in fact a cellist by profession, and truly wonderful woman. She'd been corresponding with me for 6 months because she was fascinated by stuff that was at Tony Ortega's underground bunker, and I was writing every week at that time for him. And then I'd sort of said to her, she'd read Blue Sky. She thought that was great. And I said to her, oh, you should read my novel. And she went, oh, no. Oh, no. What am I going to do? And we got there to Toronto and sat down and met for the first time. And she said, actually, I read the novel and I thought it was going to be dreadful. And at the end, and I just read it again. I just went back to the beginning. Wow. Said, well, actually, there's somebody sat at the table who's read it 4 times. And Christian Sherko looked up and he said, 5. I do have 2 fans. But my thought was, how do I take this sadness that I feel about the demise of Jimi Hendrix, who was to me one of 100 heroes. He wasn't, he's a real standout guy. I spent 2 years reading about him. Read, I think, 14 biographies. I read about the Cherokee because he was an 8th Cherokee and Cherokee mythology. I read about the blues.
Okay.
And I fused this together into a novel with the idea of, well, let's create a cult group who believe that they are the reincarnation of the Canasta people, who are a tribe that disappeared into the side of a mountain, according to Cherokee myth. And let's have these kind of home counties, they're the counties around London, accountants and people who've believed now, and they're doing all of these rituals and what have you. And let's have somebody who's an advertising agent, because I'd read so much about advertising to write about it and the Saatchis and their influence on the world. Let's have an jaded advertising man who has Jimi Hendrix appear to him as he would be, these many years later, and guide him on this little mission. And but it's just looking at
this is
Voodoo Child's slight return. And it's looking at the way that groups come together, and without wanting to be a kind of boring teacher, actually telling a cousin of mine wrote a review of it. He's a novelist, and I was quite surprised because he said how scary it was. And I was like, when you write something, I guess Stephen King sits there laughing, when he's writing these things. What a brilliant man he is too. And a friend of mine, who's himself a writer, documentary maker, he said he had to stop reading it because he got so scared. And I'm going to go, what is it?
You had no idea.
No, I
generating this sheer terror in the reader.
Yeah. There is a point where a mouse is sacrificed. I will warn anybody who is eating on mice, but that's the nastiest thing that happens. And
I have a friend who's sacrificed many mice in order to find a cure for mesothelioma. So this was a conversation we had often.
Yeah,
cervical dislocation. Yeah.
Well, it's just the one mouse in mind. I had a friend who was a genetic researcher many years ago, and protesters with banners would go outside her university, and she said, look, I took the brain of a snail 10 years ago, and I've been making more cells from it ever since. That's the only thing I've done. And look, I can't get to my car, but there you go. It's a strange world. But I also have a novel out called Halcyon Daze, which is about a psychedelic group forming in an art college in the late 60s in parallel with Pink Floyd, because I'm fascinated by the rock culture, the stories of people like Keith Moon and Syd Barrett. And I think that what we do that is to do with, as I say, I think being pro-democratic and anti-authoritarian is embedded in culture. And that, that's supremely what we're a part of a culture, of a way of looking at things. So, for example, if we look at what is called Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, its roots are in the 17th or 18th century. That's it. That's as far back as you go. If we look at Christianity, if you make comparisons century by century, every generation reinvents the culture. Prabhupada's form of Hinduism in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness was
it's not an unbroken electrical cord back to Chaitanya. Not at all.
Not at all. And
many breaks along the way.
When the Bible was translated by William Tyndale and eventually becomes the King James Bible, but he's the guy that starts that incredible literary work, and he's burned at the stake for it in a country where they don't even speak English. It's not fair. But people find that there are no priests, no monks, none of this stuff is going on in the Gospels. And you kind of go, would Jesus recognize any of this?
No, I couldn't imagine.
Yeah,
which
who is he? To Tolstoy and The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You, that this Tolstoy the novelist psychologist, he comes along and says, what about if we forget all the miracles? How are we meant to be living? And that's what inspired Gandhi, of course. It's
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
He stripped the Bible of the miracles.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he wanted to kill off all the Native Americans too.
He did have a dark side as well.
A few quirks, but
I haven't sanctified him. That's for sure.
No, and we shouldn't, and nor should we. If somebody can be an absolute psychopath. I have learned from Hitler. I know, when Hitler said, if you want to control people, give them a big lie. It's like, thank you. Don't consider your enemies to be idiots. That's Hitler. Look at them. Though, of course, Churchill hired an astrologer so he could see what advice Hitler was being given. But we shouldn't dismiss people. It is the information that they give and whether it's useful. For the most part, Hitler's very strange. First animal rights legislation. First person.
He was a vegetarian.
He was a vegetarian. He liked dogs. Very good with fabulous dancer. Incredible painter. Whole apartment, 2 coats one afternoon.
Really?
If you believe Mel Brooks, and I do. First person to say it would seem that smoking would cause lung cancer. Richard Dole's work came in the 1950s. So, but not very pro-social generally.
Generally not. So I have to take off, John, but I would love to chat again.
Yeah, we'll put something in a few weeks' time, and
sounds terrific.
And even once I've retired, I will. I can't help this. It's just
we can't lose this connection.
Yeah, great talking with Joe.
Good talking with you, John, and all the best to you and your family.
Thank you.
How's everyone doing? The family, your family.
My family are actually doing very well. It's I think we're going to start having survivor guilt soon because no
COVID cases. And are you vaccinated or?
I've had the first jab, and which was the AstraZeneca. I haven't had any blood clots.
Yeah, that's terrific.
And they're saying now that where they believe that the first shot would raise you to kind of 50% immunity, they're saying it's 75% to 80% with both that and the Pfizer. We put a bit too much of a gap. We've got a 3-month gap between them, but
that is a long gap. Yeah, I've had both Moderna shots. Yeah, so I've gotten, and Pat's got his fully vaccinated. So,
but yeah, I mean, all 4 of my kids have survived it. My granddaughter's survived it. I've lost one friend who had a heart condition, was in the 70s, which is a terrible loss. Other than that, we live in interesting times, as the Chinese proverb says, and hopefully good things will start to happen.
I'm feeling the light at the end of the tunnel. I felt that before, though.
Yes, exactly. And it was a train, wasn't it? Okay, Joe. Great pleasure.
All the best. Yep. Take care.
You too.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.